So this is something that I wrote with Sunetra Gupta, she's a professor of epidemiology at Oxford University, and Martin Kulldorff, who was a professor of biostatistics and epidemiology at Harvard University. We got together in October of 2020 because we basically it was a conference in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and our goal was to just to get together, compare notes. But when we realized quickly is that we all had arrived at the same place from sort of different angles, that the policy we'd been following, this lockdown focused policy, was an absolute disaster. It had harmed the lives of millions and millions of people around the world. I think probably killed on that order. And that there was an alternate policy available because of this sharp age gradient in the risk of mortality if you were to get infected, right? So someone who's older has 1,000 times higher risk of dying if they're infected than someone who's younger, at least with the previous variants. And now, actually, I think it's still true with Omicron. And that meant that you could protect them. You could protect the older population, the people with chronic diseases that are high risk, rather than seeking to stop community spread, which had already failed. It could not succeed at great cost, at great harm to many, many people. That strategy had failed. Instead, of the strategy of focused protection would have done better.
Was that, I guess you said you all kind of came to a similar conclusion from different routes. Was it something that you had been thinking of since the CDC or government or whoever said, hey, everyone locked down for 2 weeks? Because I think at first there were some of us, and I'm almost embarrassed to say it now, that thought like, oh, okay, that maybe that's a good thing. Did you know immediately, like, no, this is not good? Or did it take a few weeks? How did that come about?
Well, so I'll say the three of us had different paths. So I think Martin Kulldorff, when he saw the data out of China, and especially the age gradient, he immediately, I think it might have been February of 2020, wrote a piece arguing for something like focus protection, but he couldn't get it published. This is a professor at Harvard University with a very serious proposal to deal with this serious pandemic, and he couldn't get it published. So he published it in LinkedIn, in his own personal site. Sunetra Gupta, I think, arrived at it from a more theoretical epidemiological perspective. She wrote a piece in March 2020 saying that it was quite possible that the disease was very widespread, but not nearly as deadly as people thought. And she wrote it down in a very elegant theoretical model in this piece in response that she published in this Med Archives, which is a working paper. It's a non-peer-reviewed place, and she couldn't get it published. But it caused a stir because what she said was that, look, all these models we're using to project all these deaths make an assumption about the nature of the disease, that it's not all that widespread, but it's incredibly deadly. But in fact, it was possible, she argued, that it was less deadly and much more widespread than people had realized. And again, this is from a theoretical perspective. I arrived at this from a less theoretical perspective. I mean, I had been working in the H1N1 days on the H1N1 epidemic in 2009, and I noticed during that time that there was an evolution in the literature about the death rate from H1N1. The very earliest reports reported, death rates of like 3, 4, 5%, much higher, very high death rates from infection. But it turned out that they had missed a very large number of people who had been infected but never showed up because they had relatively mild infection. They never showed up for the public health people. And so there were a whole bunch of these studies called seroprevalence studies. Seroprevalence means whether you have antibodies in your blood that provide evidence that you've been previously infected. And it turned out that in H1N1, after those seroprevalence studies were run, there were 100 or more times infections than cases. Lots and lots of infections went under the radar screen in public health. And so the death rate actually from H1N1 was 2 orders of magnitude lower than the initial reports. It was more like 0.1%, 0.01%. I mean, 0.202% rather than 3, 4, 5%. And so my thought almost immediately was, well, what if we're seeing that same phenomenon here? What if we are missing many, many infections? We don't really have good testing capacity in March 2020. It's quite possible that we're missing a lot of cases, a lot of infections. So that's how I arrived at some skepticism about the traditional narrative that led to the lockdown. And I conducted a couple of studies, actually 3 studies on seroprevalence that confirmed that in April of 2020. So for me, it was a more empirical path. For Sinetra, it was a more theoretical path, and for Martin, it was a biostatistical path. I mean, given our backgrounds, it made sense. But we'd arrived at the same place.